suffocating silence of a night that seems to hold its breath, a single decision has the power to shatter everything. Beneath the surface of loyalty and trust, a dark current of betrayal begins to surge, slow, silent, and merciless. Randy stands at the threshold of a choice that will stain his hands forever, trapped in a game where every move costs a soul and every hesitation could mean death. In this story, rage collides with fear, trust fractures into shards, and the weight of survival crushes what remains of morality. What begins in the shadows will not stay there, it will spill into the light, tearing apart everything and everyone it touches. The room was drenched in darkness, the kind that didn't simply sit quietly but crawled along the walls, thick and heavy, swallowing sound and light alike. Every breath Randy took was thin, sharp, as if the air itself refused to grant him relief. The concrete beneath his boots radiated a damp chill that climbed through his bones like slow poison, threading itself around his spine. The walls were painted in a matte black, the kind that ate light instead of reflecting it, turning every shadow into something alive and patient. It was not merely a room, it was a cage without bars, a space where choices became traps and silence became an executioner. In the corner of that oppressive black box sat Leslie, unmoving, a silhouette carved from stone. The dim, single light bulb hanging above the center of the room cast a sickly yellow halo that didn't quite reach him, leaving half of his face swallowed in shadow. But what the light did catch was enough: the cold curve of his jaw, the absence of warmth in his gaze, and the stillness of a man who never acted without certainty. He lifted a single hand, deliberate and slow, as though every movement had already been rehearsed. Between his fingers was a photograph. He extended it outward, and that was all it took for something inside Randy to jolt. The sound of paper brushing across the table's splintered wood seemed louder than anything else in the room. The image stared back at him, and in an instant the suffocating cold grew even sharper. Nicole. Not just a name. Not just a face. She was the thread tied to every fragment of hope he had tried to keep alive in this rotten world. And now, in the merciless hands of the man before him, she was reduced to an object, a target, a demand, a weapon to bend him. The unspoken command filled the air like smoke, acrid and thick. Nicole must disappear. No explanations. No negotiations. No way out. Randy's fists curled until his knuckles whitened, fingernails biting into flesh hard enough to draw blood. But the pain was distant, meaningless. The weight of Leslie's unspoken threat pressed down on his chest like a boot grinding bone to dust. If Randy refused, they wouldn't just come for him. They'd come for his family. His mother. His sister. Everyone he still had tethered to this fragile world would be nothing but collateral damage. Leslie had made sure of that. There were no open doors, no hidden exits. Every corner of Randy's life had already been mapped, weaponized. The walls seemed to inch closer with every heartbeat. The dim bulb above swayed ever so slightly, making the shadows flicker across the photograph on the table. Nicole's face was illuminated in flashes, as though the darkness itself was trying to consume her image. His breath quickened, not from fear, but from the fury building behind his ribs, raw, corrosive fury at the world, at Leslie, at the way everything always came back to this, being someone else's tool. He had promised himself years ago that he would never become the thing he despised. He had built his life around that promise. Every line he had drawn was meant to keep the darkness on the other side. But now, standing in this room, with that photograph staring back at him like a quiet accusation, Randy understood what it meant to be cornered by fate. To be stripped of the luxury of choosing right over wrong. Images flickered in the back of his mind like broken film reels. His sister laughing in the sun. His mother holding his hand. Nicole smiling without knowing how fragile that safety net really was. All of it trembled on the edge of destruction. One command from Leslie, and everything that mattered would be turned to ash. But if he obeyed, if he did what they wanted, he would bury the last human part of himself. He would become exactly what he had sworn never to be, a monster. Sweat slid down the back of his neck in a cold line. His lungs ached as if the air in the room had grown too heavy to breathe. The silence was maddening, crawling beneath his skin like static. Two voices warred inside him, clawing at each other with teeth and bone. One screamed to hold the line, to protect what was left of his soul. The other whispered of survival, not the noble kind, but the cruel, necessary kind that left corpses in its wake. And the second voice was winning. He could see it so clearly now, the cruel elegance of Leslie's game. The man didn't need to yell, didn't need to raise a weapon. He held power in the quiet certainty that Randy would break himself. It was the kind of control born not from brute force, but from precision, from knowing exactly where to press until the fractures turned into shattering. A faint gust slipped through a crack in the wall, making the hanging bulb sway again. It cast Leslie's figure in motion, tall, silent, predator-like. He finally rose from the chair, not a word leaving his lips, because he didn't need words. The decision wasn't his to make anymore. It belonged to the fear wrapping itself around Randy's throat. Leslie walked past him, slow, measured, as if savoring the inevitability of what was about to unfold. When the heavy door closed behind him, the silence deepened into something almost physical. Randy was alone now. Alone with a photograph and the ghost of a choice that wasn't truly a choice. The paper crinkled under his trembling fingers as he lifted it. Nicole's eyes stared straight at him from the photograph, open, trusting, alive. Unaware of the noose tightening around her. He wanted to scream but his voice wouldn't come. The anger rose like a storm tide, flooding every inch of him with a heat that felt too big for his body. He wanted to destroy something, anything, to tear this entire place apart, to rip the ceiling down and crush Leslie beneath it. But rage meant nothing here. Rage didn't change the rules. Rage didn't keep people alive. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a colder part of him began to surface. A part forged from too many betrayals, too many nights spent bleeding in silence. It whispered calculations. If he eliminated Nicole, his family would live. If he didn't, they would die screaming. If he tried to fight Leslie outright, the outcome would be worse. The part of him that still believed in right and wrong recoiled from that thought. But the part of him that had survived this long, survived betrayal, torture, and the machinery of people like Leslie, understood the brutal arithmetic of power. His pulse roared in his ears. The shadows stretched and bent with each shallow breath he took. He felt the photograph cutting into his palm, sharp at the edges. He closed his eyes and for a moment allowed himself to imagine a different world. A world where he could walk out of this room, burn everything down, and take Nicole far away from all of this. But when he opened his eyes, the darkness was still here. And there were no such worlds left. His legs trembled as he took a single step toward the table. The echo of his boot against the concrete was louder than it should have been, a brutal reminder that in this room, everything was stripped bare. There was no space for hesitation. Every second he lingered meant another second Leslie's people had to prepare. He pressed his thumb into the photograph, leaving a smudge over Nicole's printed face. He imagined her real face, the way her eyes narrowed when she was trying to figure him out, the way her voice carried that sharp honesty he could never quite match. He hated himself for thinking that he might be the one to extinguish that light. He had seen what Leslie's world did to people who hesitated. He had watched men burn for refusing to kneel. He had carried bodies down into the cold earth, men who once swore they would never bend. He wasn't naive anymore. Not here. Not in this game. But knowing the rules didn't make them easier to accept. The bulb above flickered, sending staccato bursts of light across the walls, like flashes of gunfire. In those split seconds of shifting light, Randy saw himself reflected in the darkness. Not as he wanted to be. As he truly was. Tired. Cornered. A man standing at the edge of a precipice, and knowing that whichever way he stepped, the fall would break him. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of being forced to decide who he was willing to become. The storm inside him crested into something colder. Not resignation. Not surrender. Something sharper. A stillness that wasn't peace but preparation. If Leslie wanted a monster, maybe that's what he would become. But not on Leslie's terms. Not as someone else's weapon. If he had to fall, he would make sure the world bled with him. He shoved the photograph into his jacket, feeling the fragile paper crumple against his chest like a heartbeat that wasn't his. Every step he took toward the door felt heavier, as though the room was trying to pull him back in, to drown him in indecision. But Randy had crossed a line inside himself. He could never return. Outside, the night pressed against the world like a predator waiting to strike. The streets were slick with rain, the lamps casting pale halos across the pavement. He pulled his hood up, disappearing into the darkness, blending into it like it was a second skin. The decision hadn't been made, not fully. But the path was already laid. Nicole's life was balanced on a razor's edge. His own humanity dangled beside it. He thought of the people who depended on him, of the hands that had held his when the world had nothing else to offer. He thought of what would happen if he failed them. Then he thought of Nicole, of what it would mean to let Leslie win. Two worlds, both soaked in blood. One way or another, someone wouldn't survive this. In the distance, thunder rolled low and deep, a sound like something ancient waking from sleep. The rain began to fall harder, soaking through his clothes, clinging to him like judgment. He walked faster. Every step he took wasn't just moving him closer to Nicole. It was moving him closer to the moment he would have to choose who he truly was. The rage that had once burned so hot now simmered beneath the surface like molten iron, waiting. It wasn't the blind, screaming kind anymore. It was quieter. More dangerous. It would guide him, one way or another. The image of Leslie's cold, precise gaze lingered behind his eyelids like a scar. That man thought he owned the game. Thought he had pressed Randy into a corner with no way out. But monsters weren't born, they were made. And Leslie had just made one. The night swallowed Randy whole as he disappeared into it, the photograph warm against his chest despite the cold. Somewhere in that darkness, decisions would be made that could not be undone. The night dragged on like an open wound, bleeding slowly, refusing to close. The air outside was no longer silent, it was heavy, suffocating, as if the world itself had borne witness to a sin it could not forgive. Randy stood alone, the weight of his choice pressing into his chest like a blade. He could still feel the rough texture of the photograph Leslie had handed him. An object so small, yet capable of unraveling everything. His knuckles ached from how hard he had clenched his fists. The room smelled of iron and fear, and somewhere deep inside him, something had cracked beyond repair. What haunted him most wasn't the act itself, but the moment before it, that single breath where he could have walked away, could have chosen differently. That moment now lived like a ghost in his head, replaying in endless loops, whispering that everything that followed was his doing. There would be no forgiveness for this, not from others, not from himself. The reflection he would see tomorrow morning would not be Randy anymore, but a stranger with blood on his hands and silence in his soul. Leslie's shadow still lingered in the corners of his mind, a quiet reminder that even if he survived this, he would never truly be free. The power she held wasn't in the threats she made, but in the way she had made him become everything he despised. She didn't need to pull the trigger, she simply had to hand him the gun and let the darkness inside him do the rest. Nicole's absence carved itself into the air, not loud, not sudden, but devastatingly permanent. And it was in that stillness, in the quiet after the storm, that the reality of what he had done finally struck him with full force. Randy realized that monsters aren't born in the shadows, they're forged in choices. Step by step, moment by moment, a single human soul can be reshaped into something unrecognizable. And tonight, under a sky that seemed to mourn along with him, Randy had crossed a line he could never uncross. There was no redemption waiting on the other side of this night. No absolution, no warm light to guide him home. Only the cold echo of his own heartbeat, thudding like a countdown, dragging him toward the inevitable end. In that darkness, he understood one final truth: once you let the monster in, it never leaves. It becomes you. And there, in the hollow quiet, Randy became exactly what he swore he never would, a man who had chosen darkness over everything else.